Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place where your thoughts can slow down, stretch out, and rest for a while. Tonight we're going to wander together into a gentle mystery, one that doesn't ask you to solve it, or even fully understand it. It only asks that you listen, comfortably, as the mind softens and curiosity takes a slower breath. Before we begin, if you enjoy these calm explorations, you're always welcome to like this video or subscribe, but only if it feels right for you. And if you'd like, you can leave a comment sharing where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always quietly wonderful to imagine all of us scattered across different nights and different hours, listening together in our own small pockets of time. Now, if you can, dim the lights a little. Maybe let the room settle. Perhaps there's a soft hum somewhere nearby, a fan, distant traffic, or the quiet sound of nothing in particular. And if your mind begins to drift at any point, that's perfectly fine. You don't need to hold on to every word. We'll keep moving gently, whether you're fully awake or already halfway into sleep. Tonight's question is a delicate one. It's not sharp or urgent. It's more like a whisper you almost hear while passing through a familiar place. What if some of the strange moments people describe, moments when time seems to slip or soften or briefly lose its footing, are not just mistakes of memory or attention? And what if, just as softly, they are not proof of anything extraordinary either? What if they live somewhere in between, in a quiet overlap between the way the mind builds reality and the way the universe itself handles time? People sometimes call these moments time slips. They're usually described as brief experiences where something feels subtly out of place. A street that looks like it belongs to another era. A building that seems older or newer than it should be. A moment of certainty that you've been here before, even when you know you haven't. Or a stretch of time that feels strangely expanded or compressed, as though the clock hesitated, then carried on without explaining itself. These experiences are not about dramatic journeys through centuries or meeting historical figures. They are much quieter than that. Often they last only seconds, sometimes minutes. And afterward, what remains is not excitement, but a lingering sense of unease or wonder, a feeling that reality briefly showed a seam, then smoothed it over again. Tonight we won't rush to decide what these moments mean. Instead, we'll move slowly through 3 gentle layers. First, we'll listen to the experiences themselves, the way people describe them, and the emotions that tend to follow. Not to judge them, and not to sensationalize them, but simply to understand their texture. Then, we'll step a little closer to the mind. We'll explore how the brain constructs time, memory and continuity, and why it sometimes produces experiences that feel deeply real, even when they don't fit neatly into our expectations. And finally, we'll widen our view just enough to glance at physics and philosophy, not to prove that time slips are messages from other realities, but to notice something quietly important. Even in well-tested science, time is not as simple or as solid as it feels. The universe itself does not always agree with our everyday intuition. Throughout this journey, there's no test at the end, no answer you're expected to arrive at. If you fall asleep somewhere along the way, you won't miss the point. In fact, that might be the most appropriate response of all, because time, as we experience it, is not a rigid line ticking forward with mechanical precision. It's something your mind assembles moment by moment, like a story told just quickly enough that it feels continuous, and most of the time, that story is wonderfully reliable. It keeps you oriented, it helps you move through the world without confusion. But occasionally, very occasionally, the stitching shows. A moment lingers too long, or passes too quickly. A place feels familiar in a way you can't explain. And for a breath or two, you're left with the impression that reality might be deeper, or stranger, or more layered than you usually need it to be. Some people brush these moments away, Others hold on to them for years. Most of us fall somewhere in between, unsure what to think but unable to forget how real it felt. As we continue, we'll treat these experiences with a kind of quiet respect. Not because they must mean something extraordinary, but because they happened to someone, and they left an impression. And impressions, especially the gentle and unsettling ones, deserve a calm place to rest. So for now, let the question stay open. Let it float without needing to land. What if time as you experience it is not a single, unbroken stream, but a careful construction? And what if, every so often, that construction pauses just long enough for you to notice the craftsmanship? With that thought resting lightly in the background, we can begin to drift toward the stories themselves and the subtle ways they tend to begin, not with drama, but with a quiet sense that something feels just slightly out of place, and we'll do it slowly. When people talk about time slips, they rarely begin with certainty. They begin with a feeling, a subtle sense that something ordinary has shifted just enough to feel unfamiliar. Not broken, not dramatic, just slightly out of place, like a word pronounced correctly but in the wrong sentence. One of the earliest and most often mentioned stories comes from the early 20th century, when two academics visiting the grounds near the Palace of Versailles described an afternoon walk that seemed to drift into another era. They wrote of unfamiliar clothing, an odd stillness in the air, and buildings that didn't match the guidebooks of their own time. The experience did not arrive with fanfare. There was no flash, no sudden realization of travelling through history. Only later, when they compared notes and checked records, did the strangeness begin to solidify into something they could not easily explain. What matters most about this story is not whether it was a literal step into the past. What matters is the way it unfolded, quietly, gradually, with uncertainty, and with a lingering sense that reality had briefly loosened its grip, then tightened again as if nothing had happened. In more recent years, similar stories appear online, scattered across forums, comment sections, and late-night posts written by people who often hesitate before sharing. They describe stepping into a familiar street that suddenly feels older, quieter, or oddly staged. Cars that look slightly wrong, storefronts that seem out of sync with memory, or moments where time itself feels padded, stretched, as though the world is moving through thick air. These accounts vary wildly in detail, but they share a common tone. People don't describe excitement. They describe hesitation, confusion, a careful retracing of steps afterward, as if walking back through the moment might reveal a loose thread. Importantly, these experiences are not presented as deliberate journeys. No one sets out intending to slip through time. There are no machines, no rituals, no sense of control. Time slips, as they are commonly reported, happen to people going about ordinary lives, walking, commuting, exploring, thinking about something else entirely. That ordinariness is part of what makes them unsettling. If these stories were grand and theatrical, they would be easier to dismiss, but instead they tend to arrive in places that should feel safe and known. A park, a street corner, a cafe. And afterward, the question is not, where did I go? But why did this feel so real? It's also worth noticing what these stories are not. They are not about changing history. They are not about meeting famous figures. They don't come with new knowledge or warnings or revelations. Most of the time, the experience ends without resolution. The world simply returns to itself, leaving the person to carry the memory alone. This is why many people hesitate to talk about these moments at all. There's nothing to prove, nothing to gain, only the risk of being misunderstood. Some listeners might already feel a quiet skepticism forming, and that's healthy. These accounts are personal, they are subjective, They resist measurement. And tonight we're not here to insist that every story reflects an external event. Instead, we're here to notice something softer and more reliable. Across decades and cultures, people describe moments where the continuity of time feels briefly interrupted, not shattered, just misaligned. And whether the cause lies entirely within the mind or brushes against something deeper, the experience itself has a recognizable shape. It often begins with stillness, a pause. Sounds seem muffled or distant. Movement feels slowed, as though the scene is waiting for a cue. Then comes the awareness, not fear but alertness, a heightened attention to detail, as if the mind has turned up the brightness on the world. And finally, there is the return, a step forward, a blink, a breath, and the moment dissolves. Later, when people try to recall exactly how long it lasted, the answers vary. Seconds feel like minutes. Minutes collapse into something shorter. Time, in memory, refuses to sit still. This is an important detail because it points us toward a crucial idea we'll keep returning to throughout this journey. Time, as you experience it, is not just something that happens to you. It is something your mind actively creates. That doesn't make the experience meaningless. In fact, it makes it more interesting. Because the systems that build your sense of time are usually so reliable that you rarely notice them at all. They work quietly, efficiently, stitching moments together into a seamless flow. But when something interrupts that process, even briefly, the result can feel profound. Some people interpret these interruptions as glimpses into parallel realities. Others see them as memory glitches, attention shifts, or the mind briefly losing its rhythm. And many remain undecided, holding the experience without naming it. Tonight we won't force a label onto these stories. We'll let them remain what they are, accounts of moments that did not fit cleanly into expectation, and that left a lasting impression precisely because of their subtlety. As we continue, we'll begin to look more closely at how the mind normally keeps time moving smoothly and why it sometimes hesitates. Not to explain these stories away, but to understand the quiet machinery that makes them possible in the first place. For now, let the story settle. You don't need to decide what they mean. You only need to notice that they exist, quietly scattered along the edges of ordinary life, waiting for someone to listen without rushing to conclude. When people try to describe a time slip, they often struggle not because the memory is vague, but because it is too vivid in the wrong places. Certain details feel unusually sharp, while others seem strangely absent. It's as if the world briefly rearranged its priorities, choosing what to emphasize and what to soften. One of the most common descriptions is a change in atmosphere. Not weather exactly, but presence. The air feels thicker or quieter. Sounds seem muted as though wrapped in fabric. Footsteps echo differently. Voices, if there are any, feel distant or oddly flat. Even familiar places can take on a staged quality, like a carefully built set waiting for actors who haven't arrived yet. Alongside this comes a heightened attention to detail. People often remember textures very clearly. The pattern of cobblestones, the cut of clothing, the colour of signs or storefronts. These details don't announce themselves as unusual in the moment. They only begin to feel strange afterward, when compared to memory or expectation. And then there is the emotional tone, which is surprisingly consistent across stories. It is rarely panic. More often, it is a calm alertness, a quiet sense that something deserves attention, a feeling of being gently watched by the moment itself. Some describe it as familiarity without context, a sense of recognition that doesn't attach to any specific memory. Others feel the opposite, a sudden distance from a place they know well, as if seeing it through someone else's eyes. Both reactions can exist at once, creating a subtle tension that is hard to name. time within these moments behaves differently. It may feel stretched, each second unfolding slowly, deliberately, or it may feel compressed, as though several moments slipped by unnoticed. When people later try to estimate how long the experience lasted, they often find that the answer keeps changing. The memory resists being measured. This fluidity is important. It tells us that whatever is happening, it does not sit comfortably on a stopwatch. It belongs to a more subjective layer of experience, where time is felt rather than counted. Interestingly, many time slip accounts include a moment of realization, but it tends to arrive late, not during the experience, but after. In the moment, everything often feels coherent. It is only when the person steps away, looks back, or compares notes with reality as they expect it to be, that the strangeness crystallizes. This delayed recognition matters, because it suggests that the experience itself does not announce itself as impossible. It feels internally consistent, and that internal consistency is one of the reasons it can linger so powerfully in memory. People also often note how the experience ends. There's rarely a dramatic conclusion. No sudden jolt, no clear boundary. The world simply resumes its usual rhythm. Sounds return to normal, movement picks up, the place feels like itself again, and the moment, whatever it was, closes quietly behind them. What remains afterward is not certainty, but a question, and questions, especially unanswered ones, have a way of staying with us. Some listeners might notice how similar these descriptions are to moments of deep absorption or flow, when attention narrows and the outside world fades slightly. Others might recognize echoes of déjà vu, where familiarity arises without a clear source. These comparisons are not meant to reduce the experience, but to place it gently among other states the mind is capable of entering. Because the mind does not experience reality in a single, uniform way. It shifts tone and texture depending on attention, emotion, fatigue, and countless other subtle factors. Most of the time, these shifts are smooth enough that we don't notice them, but occasionally they stand out. It's also worth noting what people do not report. They don't usually describe pain. They don't report loss of control. They are able to move, to think, to decide. The experience feels immersive, not overpowering. This suggests that whatever is happening, it is not a breakdown of perception, but a variation within it. This distinction is important, especially for a quiet exploration like ours. We're not looking at moments where reality collapses. We're looking at moments where it gently bends. As we continue, it may help to think of perception not as a window, but as a fabric. Most of the time, that fabric lies flat and smooth, showing a clear picture of the world. But under certain conditions, it can wrinkle or fold, creating shadows and highlights that were not there before. A time slip, then, may not be a tear in reality, but a fold in experience, a place where layers overlap just enough to be noticed, and noticing in itself can change how a moment feels. In the next part of our journey, we'll begin to explore why the mind is capable of producing these folds so naturally. How systems designed to keep time flowing smoothly can, under the right conditions, create moments that feel paused, stretched, or strangely out of step. For now, let this texture settle in your awareness. You don't need to analyze it. Just notice how these experiences tend to feel more like a shift in atmosphere than a change in location. More like a question gently asked than an answer firmly given. And as you rest with that idea, it may already begin to feel less unsettling and more like one of the many subtle ways the mind and world quietly meet. There is a quiet comfort in realizing that time does not always behave the way we expect it to, even in the most ordinary moments of our lives. You may have experienced this without giving it much thought. You arrive somewhere and realise you don't remember the journey at all. The streets were familiar, the turns were routine, yet the time between leaving and arriving feels strangely empty, as though it folded itself away while you weren't looking. This isn't unusual. In fact, it happens to most people far more often than they realise. Think of a morning commute you've done dozens of times. Your body knows the route so well that your attention drifts elsewhere. Perhaps you're thinking about the day ahead, or replaying a conversation, or simply letting your thoughts wander without direction. When you arrive, the clock says 10 minutes have passed, but your experience of those 10 minutes is thin and blurred, like a paragraph skimmed rather than read. This is one of the mind's most practical skills. When something is familiar and predictable, the brain saves energy by reducing how much detail it records. Time doesn't disappear, but your awareness of it becomes lighter. The minutes still pass, but they leave fewer footprints behind. Now imagine the opposite situation. Something unexpected happens. A sound, a movement, a sudden sense that something is different. In those moments, time often seems to slow down. Details sharpen. You notice textures, colours, expressions. Seconds feel longer, fuller, as though the moment is stretching itself open. These two experiences, missing time and expanded time, are not opposites. They are two sides of the same process. Your sense of time expands or contracts based on how much attention is being devoted to the present moment. This is important because it shows us that time, as you feel it, is elastic. It stretches and compresses depending on context, emotion, and focus. And most of the time, this elasticity is smooth enough that we don't question it. But occasionally, the shift is noticeable. Consider moments of deep absorption when you're reading a book, watching a film, or working on something that fully captures your attention. Hours can pass in what feels like minutes, or moments of anxiety, where waiting for a result or an answer makes each second feel heavy and slow. In both cases, the clock on the wall keeps moving at its usual pace, but your inner clock does not agree. These everyday distortions don't usually feel mysterious. We have familiar explanations for them. We say we were distracted, or focused, or lost in thought. And because these explanations are comfortable, we rarely linger on them. But when a similar distortion happens in a context we don't expect, in a place that should feel stable and predictable, it can feel different, more unsettling, more significant. A time slip experience often includes this same change in temporal texture, but without an obvious reason. Attention sharpens or blurs without warning. The moment feels padded or hollow, and because the shift doesn't match the situation, it stands out. This doesn't mean the experience is imaginary. It means that the same mechanisms that quietly shape your daily sense of time are at work in a slightly different configuration. Another common example is what some people call highway hypnosis. You're driving, alert enough to stay safe, but not consciously tracking every detail. When you arrive, you realise you don't remember large portions of the drive. Time passed. You functioned. But awareness was minimal. The mind has many such modes. Some are vivid and detailed, others are economical and efficient, and your sense of time changes accordingly. What's interesting is that in many reported time slips, people describe a sudden shift from one mode to another. A moment of drifting awareness snaps into sharp focus. Or a period of heightened attention dissolves just as suddenly. This abrupt transition can make the experience feel meaningful, even if the underlying process is something the brain does all the time. There is also the role of expectation. When you expect time to behave normally, any deviation feels larger. When you expect a commute to be uneventful, a missing memory stands out. When you expect a place to look a certain way, a subtle difference feels amplified. Expectation, attention, and memory work together to create the feeling of time moving smoothly. When they fall slightly out of sync, the result can feel like a slip. Importantly, these everyday examples show us something reassuring. The mind is not fragile, it is flexible. It can move between different ways of experiencing time without breaking. And most of these shifts are harmless, even helpful. This perspective allows us to approach time slip stories without fear. Instead of imagining a malfunction, we can think in terms of variation, the mind exploring a different rhythm for a moment, then returning to its usual pace. As we move forward, we'll begin to look more closely at how the brain performs this delicate balancing act, how it stitches moments together into a continuous story, and how certain conditions can cause that stitching to become visible. For now, it may be comforting to recognize that losing track of time, gaining extra time, or feeling time behave strangely is not an exception. It's part of the design. And if you've ever arrived somewhere wondering where the minutes went, you've already touched the edge of this mystery, quietly and without consequence. Let that thought rest with you. Time does not always announce itself as it passes. Sometimes it simply moves through you, leaving only a faint impression behind. Or a lot. There is a small, curious moment that many people have experienced, often without realizing it has a name. You glance at an analog clock, and for a brief instant the second hand seems frozen. It doesn't tick forward as you expect, it lingers. Then, almost apologetically, it resumes its steady movement, as if nothing unusual happened at all. The clock never stopped, but it felt like it did. This moment is a gentle doorway into how the mind handles time. It's sometimes called the stopped clock illusion, but the label isn't important. What matters is what it reveals. Your experience of time is not a direct reading from the world. It is something your brain carefully assembles, smoothing over gaps so that reality feels continuous and reliable. To understand this without drifting into technical language, imagine watching a movie. Between scenes, there are cuts you never notice. The editor removes frames, rearranges moments, and hides transitions so the story feels seamless. If those cuts were left visible, the film would feel disjointed and uncomfortable. So the editor quietly does their work in the background. Your brain does something very similar. Every time your eyes move, which happens far more often than you realize, the visual world briefly drops out. These movements are quick and automatic. They keep your vision sharp and responsive. But during each movement, the incoming visual information is momentarily unreliable. Instead of letting you experience a blur or a gap, your brain fills in the missing moment. It doesn't show you the interruption, it edits it out. When you look at a clock and the second hand appears to pause, what you're noticing is the result of that editing process. The brain stretches the first clear image after the eye movement just enough to cover the gap. To your awareness, it feels like time hesitated. This illusion is not a mistake, it's a feature. It helps the world feel stable. Most of the time, you never notice it. The illusion blends perfectly into your experience, and time feels smooth and uninterrupted. But occasionally, especially with simple, repetitive motion like a ticking hand, the trick becomes visible. What's important here is not the illusion itself, but what it tells us. Your sense of time is already being adjusted, refined, and gently altered by the mind on a constant basis. The fact that you can catch the adjustment in action, even briefly, is a reminder that perception is an active process. Now consider how this relates to time slips. If the brain can quietly stretch a fraction of a second to maintain continuity, it's not a large leap to imagine that under certain conditions, it might stretch or compress longer moments as well. Not dramatically, not in a way that breaks reality, but enough to change how the moment feels. The stopped clock moment is simple and safe. It happens to almost everyone. And because it has a clear explanation, we're comfortable with it. We don't assign meaning to it. We don't wonder if we've crossed into another timeline. But when a similar adjustment happens in a more complex setting, involving memory, emotion, and environment, it can feel very different. Imagine walking into a familiar street and feeling that it's paused, hushed, or oddly staged, or stepping into a room and sensing that time has thickened. The brain may be performing the same kind of editing, but with more layers involved. Attention sharpens, expectations shift, memory searches for context. And because the experience is richer and less familiar than a clock face, it invites interpretation. This doesn't mean the experience is just an illusion in the dismissive sense. The feeling is real. The perception is real. What's being questioned is not the experience itself, but how it was constructed. Another gentle way to think about this is to imagine time not as a line you move along, but as a fabric that moves with you. Most of the time, it lies flat. But when the mind needs to adjust, it can tug and smooth that fabric in small ways. Usually you never feel the movement. Occasionally you do. What makes this especially soothing to consider is that the brain isn't doing anything unusual when this happens. It's doing what it always does, protecting continuity, preserving a sense of flow. And because this process happens beneath awareness, it can feel surprising when it becomes noticeable, like hearing the quiet hum of a machine you've always relied on, suddenly audible in the silence. As we move forward, we'll explore other ways the brain manages time, not just by smoothing over gaps, but by deciding when a moment becomes conscious at all. These ideas will help us understand why some experiences feel as though time has been rearranged, even when nothing in the external world has changed. For now, let the image of the stopped clock rest gently in your mind, not as a glitch, but as a glimpse behind the curtain. A reminder that time, as you feel it, is carefully and kindly curated, moment by moment. And sometimes, very softly, the curation shows. There is a comforting assumption most of us carry without thinking about it. We assume that what we experience happens in the same order that the world presents it. First the event, then the perception, then the memory, a clean sequence, simple and reassuring. But the mind, as it turns out, is a little more patient than that. In some situations it waits. It gathers information quietly for a brief moment, and only then does it decide what you experienced. By the time you become aware of the moment, the mind has already done a small amount of sorting and editing. Not enough to feel artificial, just enough to feel coherent. This process has a technical name in science, but tonight we don't need the label. What matters is the idea itself. Sometimes the present moment isn't finalized until a heartbeat later, and that tiny delay can change how time feels. Imagine hearing a short sound followed quickly by another. If the second sound helps clarify the first, your mind may retroactively adjust what you think you heard. You don't notice the adjustment happening. You only notice the final, polished version of the experience. To you, it feels immediate and seamless. This happens visually as well. The brain doesn't always declare, "This is what I saw," the instant light reaches your eyes. Instead, it briefly collects information, compares patterns, and fills in gaps. Only then does the experience rise into awareness as a complete moment. Most of the time, this delay is so small that it's invisible, a fraction of a second, a quiet pause beneath notice. But in certain situations, especially when events unfold quickly or unexpectedly, the delay becomes meaningful. This is where things start to feel interesting. If the mind finalizes perception after gathering a bit more information, then what you experience as now is actually a carefully assembled summary. It's accurate enough to guide you through the world, but it isn't a raw feed, it's a gentle reconstruction. And when that reconstruction takes an unusual shape, it can feel like time itself has been rearranged. Some people describe time slips as moments where the realization arrives late. They walk through a place that feels subtly different, but only afterward do they think something was off. During the experience, it felt whole, complete. Only later does the question surface. This pattern fits beautifully with the idea that awareness sometimes lags behind processing. The mind may be busy resolving what it's seeing, hearing, and remembering, while awareness calmly waits for the finished version. When the finished version arrives, it carries a sense of certainty. That certainty can be unsettling if it conflicts with expectation. I know what I experienced, the person thinks, but I can't explain how it fits. It's tempting to imagine this as the brain making mistakes, but a more generous way to see it is as the brain being cautious. It doesn't rush to conclusions. It waits until it has enough information to present a stable picture. Most of the time, that strategy works beautifully. It keeps perception smooth. It prevents confusion. It allows you to act without hesitation. But occasionally the finished picture doesn't match what you thought you knew. And when that happens, the mind doesn't immediately discard it. Instead, it holds it, examining it from different angles, trying to make sense of the mismatch. This is one reason time-slip memories can feel so persistent. They weren't experienced as errors in the moment. They were experienced as complete realities. The doubt only came later. Think of it like reading a sentence that seems clear at first, but then you read the next sentence and realize the meaning of the first one has changed. You don't go back and reread it in your mind. Your understanding simply updates, quietly, seamlessly. In daily life, this updating happens constantly. You mishear a word, then correct it. You glimpse something in the corner of your eye, then reinterpret it. These are small, harmless revisions, but when the revision involves time, place, or familiarity, it can feel more profound. Because time is not just another feature of experience, it's the frame that holds everything else together. If that frame flexes, even slightly, the whole picture feels different. This doesn't mean that time slips are nothing but delayed perception. It means that delayed perception provides a natural doorway into understanding how such experiences could arise without requiring anything dramatic to break or fail. It also opens space for humility. The mind is doing something extraordinarily complex moment by moment. It is coordinating memory, sensation, expectation, and emotion, all while presenting you with a world that feels immediate and trustworthy. When that coordination becomes visible, it can feel like peeking backstage during a performance. The magic doesn't disappear, it simply looks different. As we continue, we'll begin to see how memory weaves itself into this process, shaping not only how moments are experienced, but how they are remembered and retold. Memory doesn't just store time, it gives time its meaning. For now, let this idea rest gently. The present moment may not arrive all at once. It may be assembled quietly, just out of sight, and offered to you when it's ready. And sometimes, noticing that offer can feel like time itself pausing to catch its breath. It's tempting to think of memory as a kind of internal camera, a device that quietly records what happens, storing moments exactly as they occurred, ready to be played back whenever we need them. This idea feels reassuring. It suggests that the past is fixed, neatly archived, and waiting patiently for retrieval. But memory doesn't work that way. A gentler and more accurate way to imagine memory is as a quilt, a careful stitching together of pieces. Some pieces come directly from experience, others come from emotion, expectation, imagination, and later reflection. When the quilt is finished, it feels whole and warm and meaningful. But if you look closely, you can see the seams. Every time you remember something, you're not opening a file and pressing play. You're rebuilding the moment. The brain gathers fragments, fills in gaps, smooths edges, and presents a version of the past that makes sense right now. Most of the time, this reconstruction is so consistent that it feels identical to a recording. But consistency is not the same as precision. This is not a flaw in memory. It's the reason memory works at all. A perfectly literal memory would be overwhelming. It would store every detail equally, leaving no room for relevance or meaning. Instead, memory prioritizes what mattered, what felt important, what seemed useful for the future. That prioritization shapes how time slip experiences are remembered. When someone recalls a moment where time felt strange or a place felt out of sync, the memory often carries a strong emotional thread: curiosity, unease, wonder. Those emotions act like bright stitching in the quilt, holding the moment together and drawing attention to it. Details that support the feeling are often preserved vividly. Details that don't may fade quietly into the background. This doesn't mean the memory is invented, it means it has been shaped. There is a subtle phenomenon where information learned later can quietly attach itself to earlier memories. For example, you might visit a place, notice something that feels unusual, and only later learn a historical detail that seems to fit the experience. Over time, the two become linked. The memory feels richer, more coherent, even though the connection was made after the fact. This is not deception, it's integration. The mind is constantly looking for patterns. It wants stories to make sense, and when it finds a way to connect an experience with meaning, it does so gently and without announcement. This helps explain why time-slip memories often feel complete and eternally consistent. The mind doesn't store them as puzzles with missing pieces. It fills in what it can, guided by emotion and context until the story feels whole. There is also the question of source. Sometimes, information you've encountered in passing settles quietly into memory without a clear label. A photograph glimpsed years ago, a line from a book, a scene from a film. Later, when you encounter a similar place or moment, that information may surface without its original context. The feeling that arises can be powerful. Recognition without a clear reason. Familiarity without a name. This kind of memory blending doesn't feel vague or uncertain. It feels solid, convincing. And because it doesn't announce its origins, it can feel mysterious. Again, this does not diminish the experience. It explains its texture. Time slips often stand out not because they are confusing, but because they feel too clear. The memory arrives fully formed, carrying a sense of rightness that resists easy dismissal. And because the mind tends to trust clarity, the experience is given weight. What makes this especially interesting is that memory does not exist in isolation. It interacts constantly with perception and expectation. What you expect to see influences what you notice. What you notice influences what you remember, and what you remember shapes how you interpret future experiences. This loop is usually helpful. It helps you navigate familiar environments efficiently. It helps you learn from experience. But in rare moments, the loop can produce something unexpected. A place feels familiar when it shouldn't. A moment feels longer or heavier than expected. And when memory reaches back to understand it, the story that forms may feel slightly detached from ordinary time. It's also worth remembering that memory changes with each retelling, even when the story remains true in spirit. Each time you recall an experience, you rebuild it again. Emphasis shifts, language evolves, The core feeling often stays the same, but the edges soften or sharpen depending on what feels relevant now. This means that time slip stories, especially those shared years later, are living narratives. They carry the imprint of the original experience, but also the quiet influence of reflection. This doesn't make them unreliable, it makes them human. As we move forward, this understanding allows us to hold time slip experiences with compassion and curiosity. We don't need to decide whether they were windows into another reality or intricate products of the mind. We can acknowledge that memory, by its very nature, creates meaning, not just records events. In the next part of our journey, we'll look more closely at how the brain organizes time itself, filing moments into sequences and contexts. We'll see how a small misalignment in that system can create the feeling that a moment belongs somewhere else entirely. For now, let the image of the quilt rest with you. Each memory stitched from many threads, warm, meaningful, not perfect but purposeful. And sometimes, when you run your fingers over the seams, you can feel where the past was gently shaped to fit the present. If memory is a quilt, then time is the pattern that helps decide where each piece belongs, not just what happened, but when it happened, and how one moment leads into the next. The brain is constantly doing this work, quietly arranging experiences into an order that feels natural and continuous. You can think of this system as a kind of internal index, not a clock that ticks, but a librarian that places events on shelves, noting what came before, what came after, and what usually goes together. Most of the time, this index works so smoothly that you never notice it at all. You remember yesterday before today, breakfast before lunch, childhood before adulthood. The sequence feels obvious, almost inevitable. But sequence is something the brain builds, not something it passively receives. When something happens, the mind doesn't just record the event, it records the surrounding context, the place you were, how you felt, what you expected to happen next. These contextual cues act like labels, helping the brain decide where to file the moment in the larger story of your life. This is why certain memories feel anchored so clearly in time. You remember not just the event, but the season, the light, the mood. Everything fits together. However, when contextual cues are weak, mixed, or unusual, the indexing process becomes more difficult. The brain still tries to place the moment somewhere, but it may rely on the closest matching pattern rather than an exact fit. This is where things can feel strange. Imagine opening a book and finding a page that seems familiar, but you can't remember when you read it. The words make sense. The tone feels right. But the page doesn't seem to belong exactly where you found it. That discomfort is not confusion about the words, it's confusion about placement. Time slips often carry this same quality. The experience itself feels coherent. The sights, sounds, and emotions align. What feels off is the sense of when it belongs. People sometimes describe walking through a place that feels out of time, not frozen, not chaotic, but slightly misplaced, as if the brain is saying, I know this pattern, but I don't know which shelf it goes on. This can happen when familiar elements appear in unfamiliar combinations, a known location with unexpected details, a routine moment with an unusual emotional tone. The brain searches its index for a match and finds something close, but not exact. When that happens, it may borrow context from elsewhere, a different period of memory, a different emotional chapter, and the resulting experience feels layered, as though two times are overlapping. This doesn't require anything supernatural. It requires only that the brain's usual cues for ordering time are briefly blurred. Another important detail is that the brain's time index is flexible. It's designed to update. When new information arrives, it can reorganize the shelves, This is how learning works. This is how meaning evolves. But flexibility also means that, in rare moments, the index can hesitate. For example, when you visit a place you haven't seen in many years, memory and perception meet in an interesting way. The current sensory input mixes with stored impressions from the past. You may feel as though you're standing in two versions of the place at once, one remembered, one present. Usually the brain resolves this quickly. It updates the file and moves on. But if the overlap is strong enough or emotionally charged enough, the resolution may be delayed, and during that delay, the experience can feel suspended between times. This helps explain why time slips are often associated with familiar locations rather than completely new ones. Familiarity provides material for overlap. The mind has something to compare against. It also explains why these experiences can feel oddly calm. The brain isn't alarmed. It's not detecting danger. It's detecting ambiguity. And ambiguity invites attention, not panic. In everyday life, similar indexing hiccups happen all the time. You reach for your phone and momentarily forget why. You walk into a room and lose track of what you intended to do. The brain is briefly searching its index, trying to reconnect intention with context. Most of the time, the answer appears quickly, and the moment passes unnoticed. But when the search involves time itself, the pause can feel more significant. It is also worth noting that the brain's time index is deeply connected to rhythm, daily routines, sleep and wake cycles. Repeated patterns of activity. These rhythms help anchor experience in a predictable flow. When rhythms are disrupted by fatigue, stress, travel, or emotional upheaval, the indexing process can become less precise. Moments may feel detached. Time may feel slippery. This doesn't mean something is wrong. It means the system is working under slightly different conditions. Understanding this allows us to approach time slip experiences with gentleness. Instead of seeing them as breakdowns, we can see them as moments when the brain's organizing system briefly shows its seams. The shelves are still there, the librarian is still working, but for a moment a book is held in the hand, waiting to be placed. As we continue, we'll explore how this sense of misplacement connects with familiarity itself, and why some moments feel known before we can explain why. This will lead us toward experiences like déjà vu, where time and recognition intertwine in especially intriguing ways. For now, let the idea of the brain's time index rest quietly in the background. A helpful, mostly invisible system that keeps your life in order, and occasionally very softly reminds you that order is something being created, not something guaranteed. There are moments when familiarity arrives before explanation. You step into a place you know you've never been, yet something in you whispers, "I've been here." The feeling doesn't shout. It doesn't insist. It simply sits there, calm and convincing, waiting for a reason that never quite comes. This experience is often called déjà vu, but the name doesn't capture its subtlety. What matters is not the label, but the sensation itself. Recognition without context, certainty without memory, a quiet mismatch between what you feel and what you know. The mind usually does a remarkable job of linking familiarity to a clear source. You recognize a face because you've seen it before, a melody because you've heard it, a place because you've walked its paths. These connections happen so quickly that they feel automatic. But occasionally the feeling arrives alone. When this happens, the brain is not malfunctioning. It is producing a signal it normally pairs with something else. Familiarity is just one part of a larger process, and like any part, it can sometimes surface on its own. Imagine hearing the opening notes of a song, but before the melody continues, it fades away. The recognition is there, but the rest of the pattern never arrives. The mind notices the absence, and the moment feels strange. Déjà vu works much the same way. The signal that usually says this fits appears without its usual companion that says here's why. What's especially interesting is how calm these moments often are. Despite how unsettling they can sound in description, many people report that déjà vu feels gentle, even peaceful. There is curiosity but not fear, a sense of alignment without explanation. This emotional tone matters because it mirrors the tone of many time slip experiences. The same quiet certainty, the same lack of urgency, the same feeling that something meaningful is happening, even if you can't name it. In some cases, the feeling passes quickly. In others, it lingers, colouring the moment with a soft glow of strangeness. And afterward, the memory remains vivid, not because it was confusing, but because it was coherent in its own way. There is also a lesser-known counterpart to déjà vu, where familiarity disappears instead of appearing unexpectedly. A place you know well suddenly feels foreign. A word you've used countless times looks strange on the page. This too can be disorienting, but it often passes just as quietly. Both experiences reveal something important. Familiarity is not a direct reading of the world, it's an internal signal. And like any signal, it can be triggered under the right conditions, even when the usual context is missing. One way this can happen is when perception and memory align just closely enough to suggest recognition, but not closely enough to confirm it. A pattern of light, a layout of space, a rhythm of movement. These can echo stored memories without matching any single one exactly. When that echo is strong, familiarity arises. When the match is incomplete, the source remains elusive. This can create the impression that a moment belongs somewhere else in time, not the present and not clearly the past, but adjacent to both. A sense that you've brushed against something just outside the usual flow. It's easy to see how this might blend into interpretations of parallel moments or overlapping realities. The experience itself doesn't explain its origin. It simply presents itself as known. However, understanding that familiarity is a constructed signal allows us to hold these experiences more gently. We don't need to decide whether they point outward or inward. We can recognize that the mind is capable of producing powerful feelings of recognition without attaching them to a clear timeline. It's also important to note that for most people, these experiences are rare and harmless. They don't interfere with daily life. They don't demand action. They arrive, linger briefly, and fade. In a small number of cases, frequent or distressing familiarity experiences can be associated with neurological conditions. But these situations are distinct. They are marked by repetition, intensity, and discomfort. The experiences we're exploring tonight are different. They are fleeting, gentle, and self-contained. Mentioning this distinction is not meant to create worry, but to provide clarity. Most moments of unexplained familiarity are simply variations within the normal range of human experience. And in that normal range, the mind has room to surprise us. As we've seen, time slips, missing minutes, stretched moments, and sudden familiarity all share a common thread. They arise when systems that usually work quietly and smoothly become just visible enough to notice. The mind shows us a seam, not because it's failing, but because it's flexible. As we continue, we'll begin to widen our view beyond the mind itself. We'll look at time from a different angle, one that comes not from experience, but from the way the universe measures and handles time at its most fundamental level. This shift won't ask you to abandon what you felt. It will simply place those feelings within a larger, stranger context, where even the most precise clocks don't always agree. For now, let the feeling of familiarity rest without needing a name. A quiet signal that sometimes rises on its own, reminding you that recognition is something the mind creates, not something the world always provides. And sometimes, that creation feels like a whisper from somewhere just beyond the present moment. Most of us grow up with a quiet, sturdy assumption about time. We imagine it as a single river, flowing steadily forward, carrying everyone and everything along at the same pace. Noon is noon everywhere. A minute is a minute no matter who is counting. Time feels like a shared agreement, something the universe decided once and then never revisited. This assumption is deeply comforting. It lets us coordinate our lives. It lets clocks agree with one another. It gives us the sense that reality itself is synchronized. But when scientists began to look closely at how the universe handles time, something unexpected emerged. The universe does not insist on a single clock. This isn't an idea meant to unsettle you. It's simply a description of how time behaves when measured with great care. And tonight, we don't need equations or symbols to understand it. We only need a few gentle images. Imagine two travelers starting together, setting their watches at the same moment. One remains on the ground, moving slowly through familiar places. The other moves very quickly, carried along by speed far greater than anything we experience in daily life. When they reunite, their watches no longer agree. Time has passed differently for each of them. Not by much, not dramatically, but measurably. Now imagine two clocks placed at different heights. One sits closer to the surface of the earth. The other rests slightly higher, farther from the pull that keeps us grounded. Over time, these clocks also drift apart. Again, the difference is small, almost unimaginably small, but it is real. What these examples tell us is something subtle and important. Time is not just something that happens, it is something that responds. It responds to motion, it responds to gravity, and it responds in ways that are gentle enough to go unnoticed in everyday life, yet precise enough to matter when accuracy is essential. This can feel strange at first, because it challenges the idea of time as a single, universal rhythm. Instead, time begins to look more like a property of the path you take through the universe. Different paths, slightly different tempos. A helpful way to picture this is to imagine time as part of a landscape rather than a conveyor belt. If you walk across flat ground, your steps are even and predictable. If you move through hills and valleys, your pace naturally changes. You slow down going uphill. You move differently when descending. The terrain shapes your movement. In this picture, gravity creates valleys, and motion shapes the route. Time flows along these paths, adjusting quietly as conditions change. What matters for our exploration is not the size of these effects, but their existence. Even in the most carefully tested physical theories, time is not rigid. It has texture, it has flexibility. This doesn't mean that time behaves unpredictably. On the contrary, these effects are remarkably consistent. They follow clear patterns. They can be measured. They can be accounted for, but they remind us of something important. Our everyday intuition about time is an approximation, a very good one, good enough for daily life, but not the full story. And when intuition meets a deeper structure, the result can feel surprising. It's also important to notice what this does not imply. It does not suggest that time is constantly shifting around us in dramatic ways. It does not suggest that reality is unstable or unreliable. The differences are usually tiny, so small that without sensitive instruments, we would never notice them at all. In daily experience, time remains wonderfully dependable, yet the fact that it can differ at all opens a quiet door in the imagination. If time is not one rigid stream, but something that can vary with context, then the way we experience it may also have room to vary. This is where the connection to our earlier discussions becomes gentle and natural. We've seen how the mind constructs time from attention, memory, and expectation. We've seen how moments can feel stretched, compressed, or misplaced without anything breaking. Now we see that the universe itself does not insist on a single pace for time. These two ideas don't compete with each other. They echo. The mind's flexibility and the universe's flexibility are not the same thing, but they rhyme. Both suggest that time is more like a process than a constant, more like a relationship than a rule. This doesn't mean that experiences like time slips are caused by physical differences in time flow. The effects measured by physics are far too small to explain those experiences directly. It's important to be clear about that. But what physics does provide is a broader context. It tells us that the idea of time as a single, absolute backdrop is not as solid as it feels. It tells us that our intuitions, while useful, are not complete. And that realization alone can be quietly transformative. It allows us to hold unusual experiences with less urgency and more curiosity. Instead of asking, "How could this happen?" we can ask, "What does this reveal about how time works, both in the universe and in us?" As we continue, we'll look at a very practical example of this flexibility in action. A system you likely use every day without thinking about it. A system that depends on the universe's gentle disagreement about time to function correctly. For now, let the idea rest softly. Time is reliable. Time is useful. And time, it turns out, is also more subtle than our everyday sense suggests. The universe doesn't keep one clock. It keeps many, each quietly keeping pace with the path it travels. And somewhere between those paths, our experience of time takes shape. It may be surprising to realize that the gentle flexibility of time is not just something discussed in quiet physics papers or imagined in thought experiments. It is something quietly accounted for in systems many of us rely on every day without ever noticing. One of the clearest examples lives far above us, moving steadily through the sky. Consider the satellites that help your phone tell you where you are. When you open a map, ask for directions, or check how long it will take to get home. Your device is listening to signals sent from clocks orbiting the Earth. These clocks are extraordinarily precise. They must be. Even a tiny disagreement between them could lead to large errors on the ground. And yet those clocks do not agree naturally. The clocks on these satellites experience time a little differently than clocks on Earth. Not enough to feel, not enough to notice in daily life, but enough that if engineers ignored the difference, navigation systems would slowly drift off course. This isn't science fiction. It's a quiet fact of how the system works. The reason is simple, at least in spirit. The satellites are moving quickly as they circle the planet, and they are also farther from the Earth's pull than we are. Motion and gravity both influence the flow of time, not dramatically. Not in a way that would make a day suddenly feel longer or shorter, but in a way that adds up when precision matters. So before these satellite clocks are even launched, they are adjusted. Their timing is gently corrected so that once in orbit, they stay in step with the clocks we use on the ground. It's a careful balancing act, and it works remarkably well. A helpful way to picture this is to imagine two friends setting off on different routes to the same destination. One takes a flat, familiar road. The other travels a path with gentle hills and a faster pace. They start together. They check their watches. When they meet again, the watches don't match perfectly. The difference isn't obvious to the eye, but it's there. Instead of arguing about which watch is right, they simply adjust. They agree on how to stay synchronized going forward. This is how modern navigation works. It doesn't insist that all clocks experience time in exactly the same way. It accepts that they don't, and it plans accordingly. There have also been experiments on Earth that show just how subtle these differences can be. When extremely precise clocks are placed at slightly different heights, one a little higher than the other, they slowly drift apart. The clock higher up ticks just a tiny bit faster. This difference is far too small to affect your daily schedule. You won't age faster by standing on a ladder. But it reveals something quietly profound. Time responds even to small changes in position. These experiments don't make time feel mysterious. They make it feel responsive, like something that adjusts itself to the shape of the world rather than imposing a single rule everywhere. What's important for our journey is not the technical details of these systems, but the lesson they offer. Time is reliable, but it is not rigid. It behaves consistently, but not universally. And this realization helps us hold our earlier discussions in a new light. We've seen how the mind's experience of time can stretch or compress based on attention and memory. Now we see that even the most precise clocks must account for differences in how time flows under different conditions. These are not the same phenomena. One lives in perception, the other lives in physics, but together they gently erode the idea that time is a single, unchanging backdrop. Instead, time begins to look like something that emerges from relationships between motion and gravity, between observer and environment, between experience and measurement. It's also worth emphasizing how calm and controlled these physical differences are. They don't create chaos. They don't cause sudden jumps. They are predictable, steady, and well understood. This is why it's important to avoid dramatic interpretations. The fact that clocks disagree does not mean reality is unstable. It means reality is subtle. In everyday life, the differences are so small that your experience of time remains wonderfully consistent. Meals happen when expected. Days pass in familiar rhythms. The sun rises and sets with reassuring regularity. But beneath that stability is a deeper structure, one that allows time to adapt rather than dictate. This deeper structure doesn't explain experiences like time slips directly. The physical differences measured by clocks are far too gentle for that, but they provide an important frame. They show us that time is not a monolithic thing. It's not a single drumbeat echoing everywhere at once. It's a pattern that can shift slightly depending on how and where it's measured, and that understanding creates space. Space to consider that unusual experiences of time may not be violations of reality, but encounters with its more flexible edges. Space to be curious without needing to be convinced. As we move forward, we'll begin to build a more intuitive picture of this flexible time, not as a set of rules or equations, but as a landscape you move through, a terrain shaped by motion, gravity, and perspective. For now, it may be comforting to know that the tools guiding you through the world already account for time's gentle variability, quietly, reliably, without drawing attention to themselves. The clocks disagree, and yet they work together. And in that cooperation, they remind us that difference does not imply disorder. It can simply mean adjustment. It can be tempting to imagine time as something that carries us along, like a conveyor belt moving steadily forward. We stand on it, we ride it, and no matter what we do, it keeps going at the same pace. This image is simple and it works well enough for daily life, but it quietly hides a deeper truth. A gentler and more accurate picture is to imagine time as part of a landscape. Not a flat plain, but a terrain with hills and valleys. Some areas are easy to cross. Others slow you down. The shape of the land influences how you move, even if you're not consciously thinking about it. In this picture, you're not being carried along. You're moving through. This way of imagining time comes from how scientists describe space-time, a word that sounds technical but points to a simple idea. Space and time are not separate stages. They are woven together. Where you are and how you move are connected to how time flows for you. Gravity in this picture is not a force pulling from a distance. It is the shape of the landscape itself. Massive objects create gentle valleys. When you move near them, your path bends and your pace changes slightly. Time flows a bit differently in the valley than it does on the higher ground. You don't feel this in everyday life. The landscape is smooth at human scales. But the shape is there. This image helps explain why clocks at different heights or speeds can disagree without anything breaking. They are simply travelling through slightly different terrain. Each clock is honest about the path it has taken. When we use this picture, time becomes less like a rule and more like a response. It responds to where you are, how you move, and the shape of the world around you. What matters for our story is not the exact shape of the hills or how deep the valleys are. What matters is the idea that time has structure. It is not just a background that everything else happens against. It is part of the stage itself. This makes it easier to understand why scientists sometimes talk about local differences in time. Not because time is fractured or chaotic, but because the landscape is not perfectly uniform everywhere. However, it's important to pause here and set a clear boundary. The differences described by physics are incredibly gentle. They are smooth, continuous, and predictable. They do not produce sudden jumps into other eras. They do not create pockets where the past leaks into the present. They do not tear the fabric of reality. Stories of time slips are not evidence of space-time ripping open. This boundary matters because it keeps our exploration honest and calm. We can appreciate the richness of the landscape without imagining cliffs where there are only gentle slopes. So why introduce this picture at all? Because it changes how we think about possibility. When time is imagined as a conveyor belt, anything unusual feels like a malfunction. Something must have broken. Something must have gone wrong. But when time is imagined as a landscape, variation becomes easier to accept. Differences don't automatically imply damage. They can simply reflect the shape of the terrain. This shift in perspective is subtle, but powerful. It allows us to hold two ideas at once. On one hand, the universe is stable, reliable, and well-behaved. On the other hand, it is not simple. It has depth. It has geometry. It has structure that extends beyond what our everyday intuition expects. And when we combine this with what we've learned about the mind, something interesting happens. We've seen how perception and memory can create the feeling of time stretching, compressing, or feeling misplaced. We've seen how familiarity can appear without a clear source. We've seen how the brain organizes experience into sequences that usually work seamlessly. Now we add a physical backdrop where time itself is not a single, universal stream. Again, this does not mean that mental experiences of time slips are caused by physical distortions in space-time. The scales simply don't match. The effects measured by physics are far too small and too smooth for that. But the landscape picture does something else. It gently dissolves the idea that time must be simple everywhere and always. It invites a little humility, a recognition that reality has layers. This humility is important as we approach ideas like parallel realities and the multiverse. Without it, those ideas can feel either fantastical or threatening. With it, they become calm thought experiments. Ways of exploring how much more the universe might contain than we usually need to consider. Imagine standing on a hill at dusk, looking out over a wide terrain. You can see paths winding away in different directions. You know you're standing on one path, but the others are still part of the same landscape. They don't intrude, they don't collide, they simply exist. This image will serve us well as we continue, because when people speak about alternate timelines or neighbouring realities, the most responsible way to approach those ideas is not as overlapping worlds crashing into each other, but as possible paths that diverge quietly, each following its own gentle slope. Whether such paths exist is a question for careful theory and evidence. Tonight, we are not here to answer it. We're here to prepare the mind to consider it without strain. So let this picture settle in softly. Time as terrain. Space-time as a landscape you move through, shaped by mass, motion and geometry. Stable, predictable and deeper than it first appears. With this image in place, we can begin to explore one of the most intriguing interpretations in modern physics. An idea that does not claim ghosts or gaps, but suggests that reality may be richer and more branching than a single path could capture. And we'll approach it slowly, gently, without urgency. For now, rest with the hills and valleys, with the sense that time is not carrying you forward, but accompanying you, responding quietly to the journey you're already on. When people first hear the phrase many worlds, it often arrives with a rush of images, split in timelines, endless copies, doors opening onto alternate lives. It can sound dramatic, even overwhelming. But the idea itself did not begin as a story meant to dazzle. It began as a quiet attempt to understand how the universe behaves at its smallest scales. Tonight, we don't need to travel into technical language to appreciate the heart of it. We only need to approach it as an idea about possibility. At the most basic level, the many worlds idea suggests that reality may be richer than a single, unfolding path. Instead of one outcome being selected while all others vanish, every possibility might continue in its own direction. Each outcome becomes part of a broader tapestry, existing without interfering with the others. This is not a claim that we move between these paths. It is not a suggestion that they overlap or collide. It is simply a way of imagining how all possibilities could be preserved without contradiction. A gentle way to picture this is to imagine standing at a fork in a quiet forest trail. You choose the left path and continue walking. The right path does not disappear. It remains part of the forest, even though you're no longer on it. Both paths exist. They simply lead away from each other. In this picture, reality does not collapse into a single story. It branches. The reason this idea appeals to some physicists is not because it promises mystery or drama, but because it avoids certain puzzles. It allows the mathematics of nature to unfold smoothly, without requiring an abrupt decision about which possibility becomes real. Everything that can happen, happens, but each outcome follows its own route. That said, it's important to be clear. This is an interpretation. It is one way of understanding what the equations suggest. It is not a proven description of how reality works, and it does not come with instructions for travel or communication between worlds. In everyday terms, you might think of it as a map rather than a destination, a way of organizing ideas about possibility. So where do time slips fit into this picture? They don't fit neatly, and that's important. The many worlds idea does not predict that experiences will bleed from one path into another. It does not suggest that people will glimpse alternate versions of familiar places. Those interpretations come later, layered on by imagination rather than evidence. However, the idea does something else that's quietly valuable. It loosens the grip of the assumption that reality must be singular in every respect. It invites the possibility that the universe is capable of holding more than one story at a time, even if we only ever experience one. This shift can be comforting rather than unsettling. It suggests abundance rather than instability, richness rather than fragility. When people report time slips, one way they sometimes describe the feeling is not that they travelled somewhere else, but that something else brushed past them, a sense of adjacency, of closeness without contact, a moment where reality felt layered rather than replaced. The many worlds idea provides a language for that feeling without insisting that it must be literal. It offers a metaphor for thinking about how experiences can feel connected to something just out of reach, and metaphors matter. They help us hold complex ideas without forcing them into rigid conclusions. They allow us to explore meaning without demanding proof. It's also worth noticing that the many worlds idea does not assign special importance to human observers. The branching does not happen because someone is watching. It happens because reality itself unfolds through countless interactions, most of which have nothing to do with us. This perspective can be oddly calming. It removes the pressure to be at the centre of events. It suggests that the universe is vast enough to accommodate every possibility without needing us to manage it. As we sit with this idea, it becomes clear why it must be handled gently. Without care, it can be stretched into claims it was never meant to support. Claims about messages from other realities, claims about hidden crossings, claims that turn curiosity into certainty. Tonight, we are not interested in certainty. We're interested in resonance. The resonance between a universe that may branch quietly and a mind that sometimes experiences moments as layered or out of place. The resonance between physical theories that allow for richness and human experiences that feel richer than expected. This does not mean one explains the other. It means they can be held in the same contemplative space. As we move forward, we'll introduce an idea that helps explain why. Even if many paths exist, they do not easily interact. An idea that acts like a soft boundary, keeping each path on its own gentle slope. This boundary is important. It keeps speculation from becoming fantasy. It keeps our exploration balanced and grounded. For now, let the image of branching paths rest lightly in your mind, not as doors to be opened, but as quiet possibilities that exist without demanding attention. Reality may be more generous than we imagine, offering more routes than we will ever walk, and our experience, limited though it may be, can still feel touched by that generosity in subtle, fleeting ways. If time slips or whispers, they may not be messages from another world. They may simply be moments when the mind brushes against the idea that there could be more than one way for reality to unfold, and that thought held gently need not disturb rest. It can deepen it. If the idea of many possible paths through reality feels gentle rather than frightening, there is a reason for that. The universe appears to be very good at keeping those paths separate, not by force, but by drifting. A helpful way to understand this is to imagine two songs playing at the same time. At first, they share the same rhythm. The beats align. For a brief moment, you could tap your foot to either one and feel no difference. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rhythms slip. One song speeds up just a touch, the other lingers. Before long, they are no longer in step. They are both still playing, but they can't harmonize. In physics, there is a concept that captures this idea of rhythms drifting apart. We don't need the formal name tonight. What matters is the picture. When systems interact with their surroundings, they lose the delicate alignment that once allowed them to move together. Each follows its own rhythm shaped by countless tiny influences. Once that drift happens, realigning the rhythms becomes extraordinarily difficult. This idea acts like a soft boundary between possible paths of reality. Even if many paths exist, they don't remain synchronized. They move out of step with one another, each becoming internally consistent but externally separate. This is why it's important to be cautious with phrases like bleed through or leakage. They suggest a kind of fluid mixing that the universe doesn't seem to favour. Instead, separation appears to be the default. Paths diverge quietly and then continue on their own, without crossing. This separation is not dramatic. There is no wall, no barrier you could point to. It's more like timing. Once the rhythms are different, interaction fades naturally. Returning to our earlier landscape image, you can think of this as paths that start close together and then slowly diverge as the terrain guides them in different directions. At first, they run side by side. Later, they are separated by hills, valleys, and distance. Eventually, they are no longer visible to one another at all. This perspective helps protect our exploration from becoming sensational. If parallel realities exist, they are not stacked like pages you can flip through. They are more like trails that quietly part ways and continue without looking back. So where does that leave experiences like time slips? It leaves them in a thoughtful place. If the universe strongly favours separation, then moments where realities overlap would require extraordinary conditions. Conditions far beyond everyday life, far beyond walking through a park or turning a street corner. This makes casual overlap extremely unlikely. And that improbability is important. It means we don't need to assume that every unusual experience points to a physical crossing of worlds. We don't need to imagine thin spots in space-time opening at random. Instead, we can hold a more balanced view, one that respects the depth of physical theory without stretching it beyond its limits. At the same time, the idea of drifting rhythms offers a poetic resonance with human experience. Our own lives are shaped by rhythms that drift: sleep cycles, attention, emotion, memory. When these rhythms fall out of alignment, experience can feel strange, layered, or out of step. The mind, like the universe, is a system that values stability. It prefers consistency, but it also responds to countless small influences: fatigue, distraction, expectation, context. When enough of these influences shift at once, the rhythm of experience can change. This doesn't create new realities, it creates new textures of awareness. Seen this way, time slips do not need to be literal intersections of worlds to feel meaningful. They can be moments when the rhythm of perception briefly diverges from the rhythm of expectation, when awareness and memory are not quite in step. The experience feels real because it is real. It is a real configuration of the mind at that moment. What it may not be is a window into another physical timeline. This distinction allows us to keep wonder without confusion. It also helps explain why these experiences are so difficult to study. They are transient, personal, sensitive to attention. The moment you try to observe them closely, they change. Like trying to listen for the quietest sound in a room, only to realize that listening itself adds noise. Science excels at studying stable, repeatable phenomena. It struggles with whispers. That doesn't make the whispers meaningless. It simply means they live at the edges of what can be measured. The idea of separation between realities, then, does not close the door on mystery. It reframes it. It suggests that if something unusual is happening, it is more likely happening within the complex dance of perception than in the large-scale structure of the universe. And that realization can be deeply calming. It tells us that reality is robust. It is not fragile or easily punctured. The universe does not unravel because of a moment of strangeness. It continues, steady and patient. At the same time, it allows the mind to remain curious, to ask what these moments reveal about how experience is assembled, how meaning arises, how time is felt. As we move forward, we'll allow ourselves one carefully guided speculation, not as a claim, but as a thought experiment. If, under extraordinary conditions, a brief alignment were possible, what would it look like? How subtle would it be? And why would the smallest details feel so significant? We'll approach that idea slowly, without urgency, and without insisting that it must be true. For now, rest with the image of drifting rhythms, of songs that begin together and then part, each continuing on its own gentle tempo, separate, stable, and complete. And in that separation, the universe finds its quiet strength. Let's imagine, very gently, a situation that is not being proposed as something that happens, but simply as a way of thinking, a thought experiment held lightly, like a pebble in the palm of your hand. If under extraordinarily rare conditions two paths of reality were ever to come into momentary alignment, what would that feel like? It would not feel like a door opening. It would not feel like falling through space or being pulled somewhere else. If anything, it would feel almost disappointing in its subtlety. Because if two realities were similar enough to align at all, they would have to be nearly identical. Vast differences would prevent alignment immediately. The only possible overlaps would be small, quiet, easy to miss. So the differences, if they appeared, would likely be trivial at first glance. A style of clothing that feels slightly outdated, a car model that seems just a little unfamiliar, a sign that uses a font you don't quite recognize, a street that feels right, but not quite now. Nothing dramatic, nothing that announces itself as impossible. And yet, those tiny mismatches would feel enormous. Not because they are objectively important, but because the mind is exquisitely tuned to detect familiarity. When something almost fits, the tension is stronger than when it doesn't fit at all. A perfect mismatch is easy to dismiss. A near match invites attention. Think of hearing a song you know well, but played in a different key. Everything is there. The melody, the rhythm, the structure. But something is off. And once you notice it, you can't unhear it. That's the emotional core of many time slip reports. Not shock, but unease. Not fear, but insistence. A feeling that something is nearly right, but not anchored where it should be. If a brief alignment were ever possible, it would not last. The same forces that keep realities separate would quickly pull them back out of step. The rhythms would drift again, the alignment would dissolve without ceremony. From the outside, nothing would appear to change. From the inside, the experience would linger. This is another reason such moments, if they existed at all, would be so difficult to confirm. They would leave no physical trace, no lasting disruption, only memory. And memory, as we've seen, is already a flexible, reconstructive process. It shapes experience as much as it preserves it. This is why it's so important to hold this idea as speculation rather than explanation. The overlap, if imagined at all, would be indistinguishable from certain states of perception. The same emotional texture, the same subtlety, the same reliance on memory and interpretation. In other words, even if such an alignment were theoretically possible, it would look exactly like something the mind could already produce on its own. That overlap of appearances is not a failure of imagination. It's a safeguard. It prevents us from leaping to conclusions based on feeling alone. At the same time, it allows us to understand why people reach for multiverse language when describing these experiences. The language matches the feeling. It gives shape to something that feels layered, adjacent, and difficult to place, and language matters. It's how we make sense of experiences that don't come with instructions. Another important detail is emotional realism. In reports of time slips, people often describe a heightened sense of clarity or presence. The moment feels unusually vivid, colours sharper, sounds more distinct, attention focused. This makes sense whether the cause is internal or imagined as external. When the mind encounters ambiguity, it often responds by increasing attention. The world feels brighter because the mind is watching more closely. This heightened state can also make small differences feel larger. When attention is focused, nothing is neutral. Every detail carries weight. So if a sign is different, it matters. If a sound is missing, it matters. If the atmosphere feels quiet, it matters. The experience becomes emotionally dense, even if it is brief. And because it is emotionally dense, it is remembered. This brings us back to a key idea we've been circling throughout the journey. The meaning of an experience does not depend solely on its cause. An experience can be meaningful because of how it feels, not because of what it proves. Time slips, whether understood as perceptual events, memory constructions, or speculative alignments, share a common impact. They interrupt habit. They break the automatic flow. They remind the mind that reality is something it participates in, not something it simply receives. This interruption can feel unsettling, but it can also feel oddly comforting, like a reminder that the world is deeper than routine. It's also worth noticing that most time slip stories end without consequence. The person returns to normal life. The world resumes its familiar rhythm. There is no lingering instability. This lack of aftermath is important. It suggests that whatever happens, it does not tear reality open. It does not leave damage. It passes cleanly. That cleanliness is one more reason to favour gentle explanations over dramatic ones. As we move forward, we'll begin to look at how people try to make sense of these experiences together, how stories accumulate, how patterns are noticed, how communities form around shared curiosity, and we'll ask a careful question. When many people tell similar stories, does that mean something extraordinary is happening? Or does it reveal something shared about how human minds notice and narrate unusual moments? We won't rush to answer. For now, let the thought experiment fade back into stillness. It has done its work. It has shown us that even the most imaginative explanations, when examined closely, circle back to the same quiet truth. If something unusual ever happens, it would be subtle. If it was subtle, it would feel personal. If it felt personal, it would live in memory. And memory is already a landscape where time bends softly. When people begin to share unusual experiences, something subtle happens. Individual moments, once held privately, begin to echo one another. A story told in one place seems to resemble a story told somewhere else. Details line up, moods repeat, and slowly a sense of pattern begins to form. This is especially true with time slip stories. Across many accounts, certain motifs appear again and again, familiar locations that suddenly feel as though they belong to another era. Streets that seem quieter than expected, a strange stillness, as if sound itself has been gently lowered, clothing styles that feel slightly out of date, an atmosphere that feels deliberate, almost staged. What's important here is not whether these motifs point to something external, but that they recur at all. The human mind is remarkably good at noticing patterns. In fact, it is designed to do so. Pattern finding helps us survive. It allows us to predict what comes next. It lets us learn quickly from limited information. It helps us turn scattered events into coherent stories. You might think of this tendency as a love for constellations. Given a field of stars, the mind draws lines between them. The stars don't need to be connected for the picture to feel meaningful. The meaning comes from the act of connecting. When people share time slip experiences, the same process is at work. Individual points of experience begin to cluster. Similarities stand out. Differences fade into the background. A shared narrative begins to take shape. This doesn't mean the experiences are false. It means they are being organized. Some accounts even describe multiple people experiencing something unusual in the same place. A group notices the same stillness, the same odd atmosphere, the same sense that something is not quite aligned with expectation. These reports are often cited as particularly intriguing because shared experience feels more solid than solitary perception. And yet, shared experience does not automatically mean shared cause. When people are together, they influence one another in subtle ways. Attention aligns. Expectations synchronize. One person's hesitation becomes another person's curiosity. A comment, a glance, a pause can quietly shape how a moment is interpreted. If one person senses that something feels off, others may begin to notice details they would otherwise ignore. Silence feels heavier. Familiar features feel unfamiliar. The group enters a shared attentional state, and the experience becomes collective. This is not deception, it's coordination. In everyday life, we see this all the time. A room feels tense because someone else looks uneasy. A place feels lively because others are laughing. Emotion and attention spread easily, often without words. Time slip stories often carry this same quality. A shared mood, a shared sense of suspension, a shared moment that later becomes a shared memory. Over time, as these stories are told and retold, the similarities become more pronounced. People who hear earlier accounts may unconsciously frame their own experiences in similar language, not to imitate, but to make sense of what happened using available patterns. This is how communities of curiosity form. Online spaces dedicated to time slips, strange experiences, or unexplained moments often serve as gathering places for these stories. People read, relate, and reflect. They notice parallels. They ask gentle questions. They look for meaning. These communities are valuable, not because they provide proof, but because they provide language. They give people a way to describe experiences that don't fit neatly into everyday categories. At the same time, these shared narratives can create feedback loops. Certain details become expected. Certain themes feel more significant because they've been mentioned before. Over time, the pattern can feel stronger than the individual experiences that formed it. This doesn't invalidate the stories. It simply means that meaning is being shaped collectively, not discovered fully formed. Another important point is that patterns can emerge even when causes differ. Two people may describe a quiet street for entirely different reasons. One because of heightened attention, another because of memory blending, another because of simple coincidence. When their stories are placed side by side, the similarity stands out, even if the origins do not match. The mind is comfortable with this. It doesn't require identical causes to create shared meaning. This is why it's helpful to approach these patterns with curiosity rather than certainty. Patterns tell us something about how experiences are organized and remembered. They tell us what stands out to human attention. They tell us what kinds of moments linger. They do not automatically tell us what caused the moments. In the context of time slips, the recurring motifs may point to the kinds of experiences that disrupt routine just enough to be noticed. Quietness, familiarity with a twist, heightened detail, a pause in expected flow. These are moments that invite reflection. They also happen to be moments where perception, memory, and expectation are most likely to interact in complex ways. This is why patterns can feel meaningful without being diagnostic. They reflect shared human sensitivities rather than shared external events. Understanding this allows us to appreciate the stories without turning them into claims. We can listen without needing to conclude. We can notice repetition without insisting on explanation. As we move toward the end of our journey, we'll take one more step back. We'll look at why experiences like these are so difficult to study scientifically, and why that difficulty doesn't diminish their personal significance. For now, let the idea of patterns rest gently, not as proof, but as reflection. A mirror held up to the ways human minds notice, share, and make sense of moments that fall just outside the ordinary. In the fog of uncertainty, patterns are not answers. They are guideposts. They show us where attention gathers, and sometimes that's enough. Science is very good at studying things that are steady, things that repeat, things that can be measured again and again under similar conditions. This strength is what has allowed us to understand planets, cells, electricity, and the quiet ticking of atomic clocks. But not everything that matters is steady. Some experiences are fleeting by nature. They arrive unexpectedly. They leave no trace behind. And by the time you think to observe them more closely, they have already passed. Time slips belong to this category. They are not objects you can point to. They are moments. And moments are notoriously difficult to catch. Imagine trying to study a whisper in a large room. The room itself has noise, air movement, subtle echoes. The act of leaning in to listen changes the sound. The whisper fades just as your attention sharpens. What remains is the memory of having heard something, not the sound itself. This is similar to what happens when scientists try to study experiences that depend on attention, perception, and memory. These elements are not passive. They respond to being observed. When you focus on them, they change. If you tell someone to watch carefully for a strange moment in time, their experience of time will already be altered. Attention sharpens. Expectation grows. The mind becomes vigilant. Any experience that follows is now shaped by that state. This doesn't invalidate the experience. It simply means that it is no longer the same kind of moment. There is also the problem of rarity. Most people do not experience time slips often, if at all. When they do occur, they are unpredictable. They do not follow a schedule. They do not announce themselves in advance. This makes controlled observation extremely difficult. You can't easily set up an experiment around something that refuses to arrive on cue. Even when people report similar experiences, the details matter. The emotional state, the environment, the personal history. These factors vary from person to person, and they shape how an experience is felt and remembered. From a scientific perspective, this creates a challenge. How do you separate what is shared from what is personal? How do you measure something that lives primarily in subjective experience? One approach is to look for patterns across many reports. We've seen how communities collect stories and note similarities. This can be valuable for understanding what kinds of experiences stand out to people. It can suggest where attention tends to gather, but patterns are not the same as proof. Another approach is to use instruments. Wearable devices that track movement, heart rate, or brain activity. Environmental sensors that record sound and light. Location data that captures context. These tools can provide useful background information. However, even the most advanced tools face limits here. The instruments measure the body and the environment, not the experience itself. They can tell us what was happening around a moment, but not how the moment was assembled in the mind. And sometimes, measuring the body changes the experience too. Being wired to sensors can make a person feel self-conscious or alert. The natural flow of attention is altered. The whisper becomes harder to hear. There is also the issue of memory. Time slips are often remembered after the fact. The moment itself may feel clear, but the retelling happens later. Memory, as we've discussed, is reconstructive. It is shaped by reflection, language, and emotion. This does not make memory unreliable. It makes it meaningful. But it does mean that memory is not a perfect recording device. Science prefers records that do not change when revisited. Memories change, they adapt, they integrate new understanding. This makes them rich, but difficult to analyze in traditional ways. All of this can sound discouraging, but it doesn't need to be. The difficulty of studying time slips scientifically does not mean they are meaningless. It means they belong to a category of phenomena that sit at the boundary between inner experience and outer measurement. Science has encountered this boundary before. Consciousness itself lives there. Pain, emotion, awe, love. These are experiences we can study indirectly, but never fully capture in numbers, and yet no one doubts that they matter. time slips, whether they arise from perception, memory, or something we do not yet understand, share this quality. They are events of awareness. This also explains why debates about their reality can feel unsatisfying. If reality is defined only as what can be measured repeatedly under controlled conditions, then many deeply human experiences fall outside that definition. But if reality includes what is felt, remembered, and meaningful, then the picture becomes broader. This doesn't mean abandoning skepticism. It means practicing a gentle kind of understanding, one that asks careful questions without insisting on quick answers. Future science may offer new tools, more sensitive sensors, better ways of capturing context. New theoretical frameworks that link perception and physics more closely. These developments may help us understand experiences like time slips in richer ways. But even then, there may always be an element that escapes measurement. Some things are whispers by nature. They are not meant to be caught and pinned down. They are meant to be noticed briefly and then allowed to pass. As we approach the final part of our journey, it's worth holding this idea with care. Not everything that matters needs to be solved. Some experiences invite reflection rather than explanation. In our last session, we'll step back and consider what all of this might offer us, regardless of cause, what it means to live in a world where time can feel flexible, memory can feel layered, and reality can feel deeper than habit suggests. For now, rest with the understanding that difficulty does not equal failure. Science is honest about its limits, and within those limits there is still room for wonder. The whisper may fade before we catch it, but the fact that we heard it at all can still change how we listen. As we arrive at the end of this quiet journey, it may be tempting to ask for a final answer, a clear statement, a decision about what time slips truly are and where they come from. The mind likes closure. It likes tidy endings and labelled boxes, but some topics ask for a different kind of ending. Time slips sit in a space where answers are not easily pinned down. They touch perception, memory, physics, imagination, and emotion all at once. They borrow language from science and meaning from experience, and perhaps because of that, they resist being reduced to a single explanation. This resistance is not a flaw, it is part of their character. Whether time slips arise entirely from the mind, from the subtle mechanics of memory and attention, or whether they brush against deeper structures of reality we do not yet understand, they reveal something tender about being human. They show us that reality is not only something we measure, but something we participate in. Most of the time, life runs on habit. We move through familiar paths. We trust that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to plan for it. This trust is useful. It keeps us grounded. It allows us to rest. But every so often, a moment arrives that loosens habit's grip, a moment where time feels slightly out of place, where familiarity appears without explanation, where the present feels layered, as though it carries echoes we can't quite locate. These moments don't demand belief, they invite attention. They remind us that experience is not a flat surface. It has depth, it has texture, and sometimes that texture becomes visible. For some people, this realization is unsettling. It can feel like a loss of certainty, but it can also be comforting. It suggests that the world is larger than routine, that there is room for mystery without danger, that not knowing is not the same as being lost. In our exploration, we've seen that science does not dismiss these moments out of hand. It simply approaches them with care. It asks what can be measured, and it acknowledges what cannot. It draws boundaries not to close curiosity, but to keep it honest. We've also seen that the mind is not a passive recorder of reality. It is an active participant, It edits, organizes, and weaves experience into stories that help us make sense of the world. Sometimes, those stories feel so complete that we forget they were woven at all. And then, occasionally we notice the stitching. That noticing does not mean the fabric is coming apart. It means we've glimpsed how it's made. Whether or not parallel realities exist, whether or not time has deeper layers than we currently understand, the experiences we've discussed tonight have value simply because they prompt reflection. They slow us down. They interrupt the automatic flow. They ask us to pay attention. In a world that often demands speed and certainty, that pause is a gift, it's also worth remembering that humanity has always lived alongside unanswered questions. Long before we understood gravity, people noticed falling stars. Long before we mapped the brain, people wondered about dreams. Curiosity came first. Understanding followed slowly, and sometimes incompletely. Time slips may belong to that tradition. Moments noticed before they are explained. Experiences named before they are understood. And perhaps that is exactly where they should remain, at least for now. As you rest with these ideas, you might find yourself recalling moments from your own life. Small pauses, subtle mismatches, times when the world felt briefly unfamiliar or oddly precise. You don't need to interpret them. You don't need to analyze them. You can simply acknowledge that they happened. If you feel inclined, you might share such moments with others, quietly, kindly, not as proof, but as story. Stories are how humans explore the edges of experience together, and if you never experience anything like this at all, that's perfectly fine too. Mystery does not require participation to exist. It can simply be appreciated from a distance. As we come to a close, there is no call to action here, no conclusion to defend, only an invitation to rest in the idea that the universe may be deeper than habit suggests, and that this depth need not be unsettling. Some mysteries are not puzzles to be solved. They are landscapes to be walked slowly, noticing how the light falls, and then leaving behind without needing to map every path. Time continues, memory settles, awareness softens. Whether the answers are finished or unfinished, the night does not ask us to decide. It only asks us to be present gently for as long as we can. And if your thoughts begin to drift now, that's perfectly fine. Let them wander. Let the questions remain open. Let time do what it has always done, quietly carrying you forward without explanation. Thank you for sharing this stillness. Wherever you are and whenever you may be, rest easy.